The Confederate terrorist operations, as an advancement of COINTELPRO and MKUltra, hyperaccelerate William Barr's pre-crime affiliations to the position of the accusation of guilty without the chance of a due process in favor of exclusively a process similar to the function as promoted by Kavanaugh for the insurrection, and thus the action engages in the function of the person must be guilty because they're watching, and thus the action of implied guilt increases the capacity and justification to malicious undermining activities as they engage in their communist revolutionary behaviors, corrupting the systems as they actively infiltrate it. And thus the position of hyper promoting the function of their radical socialists engages in the function of having compromised by insurgent terrorism each of the permanent government bureaucracy, and thus the action of engaging in the permanent set insurrection completely disloyal to the rule of law under the Confederate legal theories, which is the function of anarchy. And thus, the attack against the Constitution becomes the legal theory of law, and thus their lawlessness have become law for the children of perdition. And thus, this action by their hate group infiltrating the government at the various levels engages in major terrorist activities, and thus the action of its delusion becomes uh, incorporating it into the broader fractional system, which is the only reason the Confederates were able to advance, is they separated from exclusively white trash aggression and fractured it into 1,000 different strategies. And thus the action of diverting it into the progress of normalizing in 1,000 different distractions then incorporates their ability to progress according to the hybrid warfare, and thus the action of incorporating it into the medical communities and other activities, such as the psychology of fake experiments, and then the capability of connecting them to uh, babysitters and caretakers becomes exponentially increasing, and thus the action of the theft by caretakers, which is the practical enforcement of the communism, becomes normalized, and thus the increase of their old folks' home tactics for the thefts and undermining of the disempowered becomes hyper accelerated for the purpose of their criminal military campaign by white supremacist communism, engaging in this perpetual attack, and thus the act of using electric shock therapy and overpowering people engages in the function of enforcing plays, which allows them to sell false illusionary narratives on the basis of their victims not being able to have any control over their lives, and thus the action is enforced by the surveillance agents in the diverted position, increasing the position of these plays, which includes the military strategy of taking at a permanent note the effect of the illusion on what it would justifiably be in order to automate the function of that being a normal thing, whereas they know that it's fraud, as the fact of the matter is their communism of collapsing their economic degrowth system of their competitors is their primary source of income as they hyperaccelerate off of their criminal contracts, accelerating their potential, and thus the action of that development, and thus the action of them make believing the illusion in order to turn it into reality by defrauding the record actively becomes a sustained tactic. So they compound their justifications to their electric shock therapy as a terrorist weapon, and thus hyperaccelerate these functions for the express purpose of the complete demoralizing and destruction of society as order completely collapses onto itself. And this being one of the gripes I would have against Trump, as he actively supported the electroshock therapy and um, the fake caretakers who are merely an alternative to exclusively abuse by the higher prison network engaging in these more malicious assaults. And thus, the action of changing how you receive the injury allows for the larger disillusionment, turning everyone into functional oozes as everyone collapses into chaos. And thus, the system designed properly would dissolve itself, turning everyone, especially their own, as it turns against each other. Their highest demonic levels, their highest devil powers in all of their arch powers, becomes dissolved into base ooze as everyone becomes socialist. And this fundamentally is the strategy of the psychopathics who are engaged in supporting the surveillance network, which hyperaccelerates and is founded off of the rape culture as their hyper control over the general public under the fake caretaker system facilitates the parents' rights groups who are promoted on their ability to engage in choosing the romantic interests of their children and of their community, which turns into the female narcissist position that children don't belong to the parents, they belong to their community, and thus the parent rights activists are actually anti parent rights activists, as the position of them selling it in favor of acquiring the greater controls turns it into a uh, a babysitting network hyper promoting the caretaker function for the thefts and subversions and the undermines. So there are lots of cheats that they're doing in order to sabotage the people, such as the assaults that people are designed to specifically ignore, which look, according to the illusion, like a natural defect, which is how it's sold in order to hyper promote those that they want in the central planned economy and suppress the ones that they don't want in that society to be held down into the ooze network, drowning them by the exponential additional weights, and thus the mechanism proving the system of those who are the greatest threat to them would receive the greatest amount of retaliation and thus the greatest amount of weight, and thus are estimated to have beaten their people and thus encourage the more insidious nature of retaliations and asserting their dominance over the other party as they were finally able to win. And so now their unearned power becomes a thing to get thrilled over as they overindulge in the retaliations and humiliation of their natural betters, who, being their natural betters, incite the more malicious aggression, which functionally, according to any refereed legal structure with rules, would have disqualified them as a forfeit for their cheats, which means by definition they did not earn the positive satisfaction from having won any of the various games or contests or conversations or what have you, in the assertion of the male developed hierarchy. And thus the mechanism of that puts them at the lower level of that hierarchy due to the forfeits to be registered, which has to acknowledge their participation in the subversion, which is their self confession of inferiority. And thus, in that action, has to be corrected against in the automated system. And those that have co signed to the support of that system to have engaged in it, winningly knowing that to be true, would by definition have to provide that same value to the actual winners by forfeit, as the system dissolves the purpose of having a game in the first place if the only ones who will win are the ones who are winning by forfeit, as that nullifies the entire concept of the game itself in favor of automated successes, and thus the position of them losing on purpose because they would have lost in reality as a collective concept is the fake conservatives' version of participation awards, as they act in their high and mighty function to look down on soccer moms for wanting participation awards for anyone who would participate. And thus the action has revealed their more fundamental bias, racist hypocrisies. This includes the function of actively poisoning people, such as the position of giving them um, various kinds of drugs in order to make them high, such as Ritalin, and other functions, or the act of spying on them in order to poison them under some subversion that isn't directly a part of the automated structure, but then is designed to be incorporated into the automated structure, such as the active promotion of stalking children in order to promote the gay agenda and the trans agenda, which includes the function of actively seizing the person under the Manchurian candidate and making the child think that they are a different gender by switching them with somebody else, because they are switching them with somebody else. They are physically somebody else. The mind that you're talking with is a different person using a radio system through various technologies and techniques. At that point, the person pretending to be the other person then incorporates the justification of whatever agenda they're doing, such as the trans position, and thus the person is under a threat of being murdered by the surveillance agents, which don't have a recourse and thus don't have a reason to not do their hate crime, threatening the parents with their child dying if they don't agree with the abusers, and thus the action of going through with the genital mutilation and other subversions actively incorporates the finalization of this action, which then engages in the transitions for the compelled surgery, which they're doing as a satanic agenda in order to promote the functions of their satanic sacrifices, and thus the action of their hyper religious radical activities, masking as Christian nationalism and other subversives which have been compromised by these degenerate insurgents, which includes I believe it's the Bolsheviks' position, which had infiltrated the Europeans for the socialist agenda um, by viable or semi-viable techniques, which includes the function of actively infiltrating the governments themselves and engaging in their subversions, progressing the political line systematically, um, and for every two steps forward you have against them, you take one step back as they normalize norms, and thus the action of the hypothetical or illusionary becomes reality through the systems as they conduct these militant operations, which is incorporated in the magics studied by the insurgents and the intelligence communities engaging in the hate crimes against the general public for the maturity of these injuries. And thus, the action of the government having access to them is a criminal act designed specifically to engage in conspiracies against their rights, including the position of Jeffrey Epstein and his lawyers, who use fake secrets in order to defend the position. Now, the position from the fake secrets requires them to have given it to the judges for the court of record, which is then subverted by their pseudo intellectual Confederate legal theory of anarchy, which says because the law says that you have to give the secret to the judge, then that means you don't give the secret to the judge. And thus, the position is less a legal theory, more direct delusion for the sake of incompetence, which then generates as a fake position of negligence or low intelligence, acting dumb in order to acquire their agenda, when in fact they're deliberately acting in malice in opposition as an enemy of the law and the ordered rules themselves. And as an enemy of those rules and the law, then they attack the Constitution specifically and all other functions, such as the division of diluting its value. They say the law and the Constitution. The Constitution is superior law, it is the definition of the law, and thus the action of creating these subversive propaganda techniques generates the position expressing their core loyalties as an enemy of it, which engages in the confession of their oath-breaker nature in their war to overthrow the government by sedition, systematically removing the checks and balances by compromising it with all of their insurgents, guaranteeing that the law is not faithfully executed in any way, and thus the full definition of the opposite of the obligation becomes the natural performance. These psychopaths are, in fact, the biggest threat the United States has ever faced in its history, according to these hybrid warfare techniques, requiring Congress to engage not in the function of the remedy, but the action of admitting to David Bull's title at the time of the case of the kidnapping, with the use of the function of um, acknowledging the contract schedule and the thing that was owed for their terrorism in order to block the thing, in order to change his status preemptively and thus nullify their changes, which then compels them to have recognized that that is his legal status, and they are in a position where they have no legal authority, despite the legal theory of perdition, to engage in the function of having made those reductions, and thus the government is obligated to make the full correction against it as they prepare for the duel where David, reassuming his position as intelligence oversight, acquires all of the information for the investigation in order to put into intelligence reports to deliver to Congress, uh, informing them on the sober, educated obligations for them to incite a direct action, which, according to the theory of the insurrectionists, would have included severe punishments of themselves, as sedition is their core ideal, and thus the action of undermining the process itself becomes their core idea. And to this extent, the belief from the Confederates is that Congress, under those reports, would be obligated to declare war on the Confederates or break their oath and declare war on the United States, dissolving the United States and changing its title head, or acknowledge everything that's David's owed and supports their obligations for a rational, sane society, which is going to exist on purpose and is in fact not too stupid to live, and thus fundamentally the opposite of what we have been accustomed to. Now, these systems incorporate themselves in order to be materialized into normalized society as a function of their changes. Thus, the position of their investigation of base reality and its contracts and obligations generate the negative reflection for their Shadowfell, which is what happens if the bad guys would have won in D&D, and thus the action of them actively incorporating the function of having stolen the IP data for the contracts becomes the normalized function, and thus they actively degrade it by paying the bigot tax in its variations in order to promote their political ideals as white supremacist communists, engaging in their hate crimes against the general system, and thus they compound the variations of their injuries against the general public through these mechanisms. And thus, the more you understand base reality in the motives of the crime, then the more you understand that they seek to pollute it, and thus the action of the investigation is something that they would actively try and pollute and subvert by fraud, and thus the action of corrupting it becomes a retaliation, fighting retreat technique in defense against law enforcement, and thus the mechanism prevents the function of studying the free market and retaliates against anyone who would seek the free market, and thus the action of threatening them with not having the communist contracts and thus starving them out as counter revolutionaries becomes normalized as the degenerate threat, and thus the action of understanding the original market becomes the only real solution, and thus the action of the solution becoming the problem actively makes them cowards and thus scares them away from the possibility of it, and thus the action of preventing them from escaping the calamities designed for them according to those who would like to hurt them most subvertively, uh, and thus the more valuable they are in the general society, the more value is derived by the extortion in the abuse, and thus the more important you had to have been in order to have conducted that abuse, such as the position expressed in certain theories of someone engaging in homosexual sodomy, and thus the action of sodomy in the same race is not a sexual thing for them, as it's the assertion of power and dominance, and thus the position of having proven that they're dominant becomes the satisfaction of their dominatrix philosophy as a general life lesson, and thus the action of this compounding to the higher extents includes the infiltration and assimilation of this into the violent abuses and subversions. So everything that they would see happen to other people would start to be incorporated to happen against them, and those who are of the higher power in that system would begin to use it against them for the same reason that they would have been doing the sodomy, not as sexual, quote unquote, but as assertion of power, and thus the action of incorporating their sexuality into the power becomes their base fantasy for their white supremacist communism, which by definition some have asserted the position of the Jews doing this, and thus the action has to incorporate its position from the position of them incorporating into the Confederacy, and thus the action of the straw man argument of their victims being disassociated from the whites as they having become valuable to them, um, are being used as radicals. And in the communist agenda, when you acquire the goal, the destruction of the radicals becomes the obligation, and thus the action of entrapping them in the devil religion facilitates their collapse and thus the eradication on the basis of the race, when the actual white supremacist racism actually starts becoming enacted, and thus the act of acknowledging that they are a political identity is non-subversive but is rather defensive, and thus the action of its counterintuitive opposite becomes the enforcement of actually defending their right to exist, as defending them from the plot in order to destroy them is the only way to protect them, and thus they have to go through the uncomfortable inconveniences in order to engage in the cost of business of living. Question: was Harvey Weinstein Jewish? Question: was Jeffrey Epstein Jewish? The answer is stop being a stupid idiot. The answer, of course, is that they were picked for the gimmick, and thus the action of being able to use the terror factory on them launders their goal for the larger magical agenda. They're picked for the position in order to acquire the maturity of the saturation of the illusion becoming reality, and thus turning the protocols of learned elders of Zion into reality from illusion becomes the systematic goal of their enemies, and thus has to be acknowledged as a thing so that it can be corrected against, and thus the protection of the thing is the hatred of the political identity. If you do not acknowledge the weakness threatening them, then you are actively not warning them, and thus the watchers on the wall that do not sound the alarm for the people when the enemies come. If the enemy comes and hurts them, the blood is on the head of the watchman, and thus you have to give the uncomfortable thing that they're probably going to hate you for, but will be the reason they get to live. So you can be an adult and do it, or you could be a child like the Confederates and actively avoid it for the comfortable conversations as you actively aid in a bed setting them up for the extermination. It's like the issue with David and Ukraine. The Ukrainians needed David to be in power in order to protect them against the Confederate proxy war, propping Russia into attacking them, and thus giving the false justification of hating Russians again in an ongoing Cold War, restarting the function of the Cold War, which David, as the peace child, was designed to dissolve, and thus the action of the retaliations by the white supremacists engaging in the radicalization of the racism starts attacking American Russian businesses such as the Russian ballet and other fundamental arts, generating the subversion of the thing on the basis that they have nothing to do with and had actively escaped into America to not be a part of, and thus punishing them exclusively on the basis of the bigotry becomes the status quo norm to be expected by the psychotic. The communists give and the communists take away. This is the value of virtue signaling. False market signals. At every level of fraud, at every system a con. And thus the observation of the obstructed becomes a study of this reality as the criminal intention has a different intelligence, wisdom, charisma score, which they wish to devalue, and thus the action of fundamentally changing the charts in their fraud against the records fundamentally changes the charts, fundamentally changes the reactions, fundamentally changes what is profitable to invest into, and thus the action of their central plan control over the economy by their Soviet white supremacist councils, and thus the action of the division of these controls for the human trafficking normalized by the fake caretakers engaging in the function of having control over the victims, actively engage in robbery and subversion, undermining them until they're starved to death and dissolved into the ooze, and thus the action of understanding the base market as a investigative demystifying of their functions becomes the normalization of that market, and thus the action of its observation, and thus the action of understanding that they target the patriarchy in order to destroy the aristocracy becomes a function of them engaging in de-order, and thus the action of order that would defeat them becomes the function of the position in warfare. The point is to destroy your enemy, and thus the action of the American civilian population and its law becomes the enemy, and thus the action of it being order at a higher power level than their attack becomes the status quo understanding, and thus the action of their added malice and aggression is hyper accentuated by the fact that the attacks are designed to dissolve, and thus the action of the defense being higher than the attack is the assertion of the increased weight or pressure against the things that are more powerful than it itself, and thus the study of the market becomes the obligation, and thus you have to go back to when people would have understood the original functional thing, and thus the action of each of the legend companies from David have to be understood, and thus the action of when each person would have known which services from which companies would have been available determines their attraction to the purchase of its services, and thus defining the original market and its arbitrary exchanges back and forth. To the position, you understand the hyper-radicalization of the white supremacist communists engaging in their KKK terrorist operations for the targeted communities becomes a position of security as they're being attacked, and their ability to remain safe becomes the service, and this, the services delivered without those legend companies become the known historical injury, and thus the action of them being known is the subversion of the historic outcome happening, and thus the act of the defense, and thus the act of the protection, and thus the act of the changed outcome, and thus the evaluation of the product itself, and thus the financial prices, yada yada yada, specific calculations, hyper accelerated algorithms and its full diversity need to be understood, which require David's faculties in order to have calculated in the first place, which generates the status quo function and the various application of these functions as they would actively overlap into each other, including the function of the intelligence oversight for David being above the intelligence community means David would be classified beyond the intelligence community, which means they would not have a right to the information from David, which they would then, like Jeffrey Epstein's lawyer, would take the fact that they don't have a right to do it as a right to do it, and thus the act of having a right to do it is saying that those that would fix it don't have a right to fix it, according to the classification from the pseudo-intellectual opposites illusion into reality. And this expresses the position of the various games that would have been played according to the systems, which would have actively been incorporated into the training monologues and situations for David, as he would have to conduct overlapping functions at the same time, especially at the position of the disadvantage of being a young boy, and thus the action of having too much energy and having to do something requires the action of overlapping functions of the study and the activity at the same time, requiring the hyperacceleration such as the surveillance games, which would have materialized the capacity to have acquired multiple lessons and trainings at the same time, which facilitates the capacity to have not engaged in the limitation and thus hyperaccelerated the training and thus hyperaccelerated the maturity of body, mind, and spirits, and thus the action, having matured all of them, becomes the goal of the game, which then crafts the function of how the game is to be designed and thus how it is played, and thus tracks the progress for the experience, and thus hyper magnifies itself by its multiplication, and thus the application of turning it into a larger promoted game, similar to the function of professional gamers who engage in various scrimmage matches infinitely multiple times in the arrangement of those actions as in a simulation as a profitable venture, which becomes its own profitable venture, which then materializes the position, such as but is not limited to, in the surveillance position of conducting the blue screen technology in movies, which being applied to the thing would facilitate it being incorporated into the higher art, which would then be able to express a mana system, which would then hyper amplify all of the abilities and the variations, which would then materialize into the normal application of the game, which would then have to be incorporated into the rest of the system, increasing the function of network interest so that David could be guided to the function of serving those who need contracts the most for the express purpose of the distribution of the business, such as in the brokerage, as the facilitation of the development of their businesses becomes the functional business, and thus the action of the multiple purposes becomes the purpose of these types of services, which are fundamentally non-avoidable according to the estimate and its obligations. And thus, what it has to do requires us to understand necessarily that that is what would happen. The act of the wealthy actively engaging in the corporation of this being developed according to the free market puts the money into the function, and thus the action of grading the confidence and thus the action of maturing all of the arrangements allows you to bypass any bias against it without those resources, because by definition those resources would exist and need those things to happen in order to have matured itself to absolute potential, and thus becomes mandatory according to the other businesses. But this also incorporates the fact that David would have to not be famous and thus cannot receive the attention, and thus his strengths have to be weaknesses according to the game, and thus the action of his strengths being hyper mitigated against and accelerating its opposites engages in the function of its opposites, being the promotional function for the general public, as catching up to him would not be viable. According to the estimates, the act of not making that the focus facilitates it as a payable service to the other participants who want the cheap power, and thus the unearned power, and thus the ability to buy and thus the action of pay to win actively becomes an incorporated norm into the system according to the theory, as it is an obligation for the distraction in all of its responsibility.